From this it appears that the argument of some who say that simple fornication is not a sin is vain. For they say, "Let there be a woman freed from her husband who exists under the power of no one, such as her father or any other. If a man approaches her willingly, he does him no wrong because he likes it and has control over his body. He does no wrong to another because he is supposed to be under no one's power. Therefore it does not seem to be a sin. But it does not seem to be a sufficient answer if someone says that he is doing wrong to God. For God is not offended by us except by what we do against our good, as has been said. But this does not appear to be contrary to the good of man. From this it does not seem that any injury is done to God. In the same way, it does not seem to be a sufficient response that thereby an injury is done to the neighbor who is offended. For it happens that someone is offended by something that is not a sin in itself, and thus sin becomes accidental. Now we are not dealing with whether simple fornication is a sin by accident, but by itself. It is therefore necessary to seek a solution from the above. For it has been said that God cares for each one according to what is good for him. But it is the good of each one that he attains his end. But his evil is that which diverts him from his due end. But this must be considered as in the whole, so also in the parts. Namely, that each part of a man and each of his actions may be allotted its due end. And the seed, though superfluous as regards the preservation of the individual, is nevertheless necessary as regards the propagation of the species. But other superfluities, such as hunger, urine, sweat, and the like, are necessary for nothing. Hence it belongs to the good of man only that they are emitted. Now this is not the only thing sought in the seed, but that it be emitted for the benefit of the generation for which the union is directed. But the generation of man would be in vain unless due nourishment followed, because the generation would not continue deprived of due nutrition. Therefore, the release of the seed must be so ordered that the appropriate generation and the education of the offspring can follow. From this it is clear that every emission of seed is against the good of man in such a way that the generation cannot follow. And if this is done on purpose, it must be a sin. Now I say the manner from which generation cannot follow according to itself, as every emission of seed without the natural union of man and woman, for which reason such sins are said to be against nature. But if by accident generation cannot follow from the emission of seed, it is not on this account contrary to nature, nor a sin, as if it happens that a woman is barren. In the same way it must be against the good of man if the seed is sent in such a way that the generation may follow, but the appropriate education is hindered. For it must be considered that in animals in which the female alone is sufficient for the education of the offspring, the male and the female do not mate at any time after copulation, as is evident in the case of dogs. But whatever animals there are in which the female is not sufficient for the education of the offspring, the male and the female must remain together after copulation as long as is necessary for the education and instruction of the offspring, as is evident in some birds, whose young are not able to seek food for themselves immediately after they are born. For when a bird does not feed its chicks with the milk that is readily available, as if prepared by nature, as happens with quadrupeds, it must seek food for the chicks from another source, and in addition to this, foster them by incubating them. The female alone would not be sufficient for this. Wherefore, by divine providence, the sea was naturally placed in such animals that the female should remain for the rearing of her offspring. It is clear, however, that in the human species a woman alone would not be sufficient for the education of children. Since the necessity of human life requires many things which cannot be prepared by one person alone, it is fitting, therefore, according to human nature, that a man should remain with a woman after intercourse, and should not immediately withdraw, approaching any woman indifferently, as happens with fornicators. But this reasoning does not stand in the way of the fact that some woman is able by her wealth to nurse a child alone, because natural rectitude in human acts is not according to those which accidentally happen to one individual, but according to those which affect the whole species. Again, we must consider that, in the human species, the offspring does not need only nutrition as far as the body is concerned, as in other animals, but also instruction as to the soul. For other animals naturally have their own prudence with which they can provide for themselves. Hence, it is necessary that children should be instructed by their parents as if they had already experienced it. Nor are they capable of this instruction at birth, but after a long time, and especially when they reach the years of discretion. For this instruction also a long time is required. And even then, because of the attacks of the passions, by which the estimation of prudence is corrupted, they need not only instruction, but also repression. But for these things the woman alone is not sufficient. But in this the work of the sea is more required, in which there is both a more perfect reason for instruction and a more powerful virtue for chastising. It is therefore necessary in the human species not to insist on the promotion of offspring for a short time, as in birds, but for a long period of life. Therefore, since it is necessary for the male to remain with the female in all animals, as long as the work of the father is necessary for the offspring, it is natural for man that a man should have a long-term association with a determined woman, not for a short time. And this partnership we call marriage. Therefore, marriage is natural to man, and adulterous intercourse, which is apart from marriage, is against the good of man. And for this reason it must be sin itself. Since it is necessary for the male to remain with the female in all animals as long as the work of the father is necessary for the offspring, it is natural for man that a man should have a long-term association with a determined woman, not for a short time. And this partnership we call marriage. Therefore, marriage is natural to man, and adulterous intercourse, which is apart from marriage, is against the good of man. And for this reason, it must be sin itself. Since it is necessary for the male to remain with the female in all animals, as long as the work of the father is necessary for the offspring, it is natural for man that a man should have a long-term association with a determined woman, not for a short time. And this partnership we call marriage. Therefore, marriage is natural to man, and adulterous intercourse, which is apart from marriage, is against the good of man. And for this reason it must be sin itself. And yet it must not be considered a slight sin if one procures the emission of seed beyond the due end of generation and education, for the reason that it is either a slight or no sin if one uses any part of his body for a use other than that for which it was designed by nature, as if who, for example, walks with his hands or works with his feet, something that should be worked with his hands. But the disorderly emission of seed is contrary to the good of nature, which is the preservation of the species. Hence, after the sin of murder, by which the human nature already existing in the act is destroyed, this kind of sin seems to hold the second place, by which the generation of the human nature is hindered. Now these things which have been presupposed are confirmed by divine authority, for it is clear that the emission of seed, from which offspring cannot follow, is unlawful. For it is called Leviticus 18:22, "You shall not mix with a male by female intercourse," and 23, "You shall not mate with any cattle," and 1 Corinthians 6:10, "Neither the soft nor the concubines of men, shall inherit the kingdom of God. It is clear that even fornication and all intercourse except with one's own wife is unlawful. For it is said in Deuteronomy 23:17, "There shall not be a harlot among the daughters of Israel, nor a harlot among the sons of Israel." And Tobias 4:13, "Beware of all fornication, and besides your wife, do not allow yourself to know the crime." And 1 Corinthians 6:18, "Flee fornication." By these things the error of those who say that the emission of seed is not a greater sin than in the emission of other superfluities is excluded. And those who say that fornication is not a sin